Well, thanks for coming out. Yeah, we've got a lot to talk about. You are one of the preeminent researchers at the intersection of psychedelic medicine and mental health. You created the Center for Psychedelic Research at King's College London, where they're doing...
Imperial. Sorry.
Where?
Imperial.
Imperial, that's right, Imperial College. Yeah. And it's super exciting. This is where you're doing all of the rigorous, hardcore science, exploring how these drugs are essentially changing the game, the paradigm for mental health treatment around the world. So what was the most, if you had to pick one of your most surprising and exciting findings, what would you say that is? This is obviously groundbreaking research that you're doing, but if there's one, surprising, salient finding that comes to mind, what might that be?
Yeah. It's hard to pick one. There've been a number of surprises along the way. When we did our first depression trial, just to give some context, this was before there'd been the wave of clinical trials that we now have. And so we had things like improvements in depressive symptom scores in healthy volunteers, or Charlie Grobe at UCLA showed that in people with end-stage cancer. But this was treatment-resistant depression, so everyone had severe and unresponsive depression to a range of different treatments. And so there were, a lot of doubts in our minds about whether we could even do this. And I guess that's been one of the surprises along the way, is it will sound a bit flippant almost, but it's been surprising how doable it is. And when we treated that first patient, she came in classic kind of depressive demeanor, poor eye contact, and sort of stooping and very flat, quite teary. And then to see the transformation afterwards, and this was our first volunteer, then it was like, oh, okay, there's something here. And it was a strong experience, and behaviorally she was doing some strange things, sort of just sort of marching her legs, and at one point sort of doing this beautiful hand dancing. And then later on told us, what was going on there, some quite powerful visions and imagery. And she was visited by like a guardian angel who said, "Oh, my darling." She was calling her my darling, and she said, "You need to smile more." And she was pushing her cheeks up to smile. It was really beautiful, this story she told, but she was immediately transformed. You could see it visibly. She was glowing. And she said, I remember she said that a friend of hers had got in touch, and instead of making an excuse for why she couldn't meet her, she got excited and thought, oh yes, nice. And she also thought she would wear some colourful clothes rather than the black that she was wearing quite often. So, there's subtle changes, but they're like real life changes. And that was a surprise. It was better than I expected or could have wished for. And that was the very first patient in the very first depression trial of this era, to my knowledge.
Wow. And how common is treatment-resistant depression? We live amidst an era of widespread mental distress. Anxiety, depression seem to be pervasive now in society. So how common is this breed of depression that seems to be unresponsive to traditional pharmacotherapy?
Yeah, it depends how you define it, but clinicians, if they're able to, and the system allows it, will throw the kitchen sink at depression, so drugs and psychotherapy, and then the list can go on, and interventions get more and more severe depending on the severity of the depression. It could be, electroconvulsive therapy, Now we have ketamine, but treatment-resistant depression, the number that's thrown around, if you have depression and it's not responding to treatment, about 20% of depression will be that treatment-resistant type. At least 20%. And you know, depression prevalence, it depends on the population and how you look at it, but about 10% is the typical figure we go with. And then you go with a lifetime mental illness, and it's much higher. Depression, I've heard it referred to, a bit glib, but as the common cold of psychopathology. You know, in the sense that you see a lot of it. It's very common, but it's often close with anxiety. Anxiety is very prevalent. So,
I think, I mean, for me, one of the most surprising and exciting aspects of this work that you do is that traditionally, I mean, in those patients for whom traditional pharmacotherapy seems to work, it seems to be these drugs, and I guess I'm speaking specifically of SSRI drugs, seem to work better the more severe the depression is, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, the last time I looked at these, you know, the meta-analyses, they don't seem to work any better than placebo or exercise for those with mild to moderate depression, but they do seem to be more efficacious for those with severe.
I don't think that's specific to SSRIs, though. I think it's more like a product almost of the statistics, that when you have worse pathology coming in, you have greater scope for a change from that severity. So it's more a general rule that, you know, for example, you get bigger, we call them effect sizes. They're just a bigger improvement in trials if we're daring enough to go into the most severe populations. So I think it has something to do with that. And it also has something to do with the fact that placebo is very effective in a strange way. Gets about 40% of people responding. SSRIs might be about 50. So you're up against pretty effective treatment in a strange way in just positive expectancy. It's very potent. So, you know, there was a story for a while that SSRIs are no more than placebo, or it's all placebo. I don't think that's true. They do something, and they have an action, that kind of makes sense in the context of depression. That doesn't mean that the action is something to get really, you know, excited about and claim that it's a really good action. But they do something.
Do we know the mechanism? Because I know a couple of years ago, I feel like there was a review that came out that finally put to bed the whole chemical imbalance theory of depression. Is that still the case, where it seems to have other pleiotropic aspects beyond, you know, boosting serotonin levels in the brain?
Yeah, well, SSRIs do boost serotonin levels in the brain generally, though they block the reuptake, the recycling, so there's, you know, more serotonin swimming around between brain cells, and generally speaking, probably more serotonin functioning. But serotonin does a lot of stuff. Some people have said it's involved in everything but responsible for nothing. We do know that, SSRIs will change serotonin functioning, and so they are doing that. It's just the myth that I think is a myth is that depression can be defined almost like a litmus test or an assay as low serotonin levels. That is the evidence is there's something there, but it's kind of thin. There might be something through stress and neuroinflammatory responses that cause a metabolic change that means that you have less serotonin available. But it's really not a compelling model. We do know that drugs that boost serotonin in a big way, like MDMA, make you feel good. So the story's not entirely without foundation. It's just the serotonin system's really complex, depression's really complex, and it's not as simple as that marketing story. I think this is what bothers people, is that it's a story that's been spun to sell SSRIs. That you have a chemical imbalance, you need to rewrite that imbalance. There's something wrong with my brain, fix my brain. That biocentric approach. It's too simplistic explanations of convenience, Oh, it's nice if it makes sense, so I'll just buy the story and buy the drug. And the reality is much more complex.
Well, one obvious downside of traditional treatment is that you've got to be on these drugs for the long haul. They can be difficult to come off of. They coincide often with side effects, suicidal ideation, decreased libido, et cetera. And I think one thing that's so crucial to understand about the research that you're doing and the potential application of psychedelics like psilocybin is that, it seems to have its effect during just a handful of acute, therapy sessions.
Yeah, it's less dependent on a drug, ironically, psychedelic therapy, and thinking of drugs and the connotation of drugs. It's less about drugs than treatments that are massively prescribed around the world in a billion-dollar industry. It's less drug dependent. So yeah, it's a very different model. Sure, classic psychedelics work on the serotonin system as well, but I've already said the serotonin system is really complex and does a lot of different things. SSRIs, the nicest way I've heard it phrased was from an old mentor of mine, still a mentor, David Nart. He said they incubate against stress. I quite like that. They sort of give you a buffer zone to get through life. They take the edge off things, the peaks and the troughs. But that can bring some of the limitations of treatment with SSRIs, because maybe you don't feel as much, but that can help you get through a really difficult time and ordeal, but maybe you're not necessarily living fully. Whereas psychedelics, when you don't know them and you think of drugs and stigma around drugs, you often think, oh, drugs are for escape. To get away from your problems, to run away from your problems, like people use alcohol, but the reality is the opposite. They're drugs of confrontation. Psychedelic means psyche revealing. So like your inner demons are being revealed to you sometimes, and it's frightening. So it's almost turning that incubation against stress on its head. For the trip itself, it's like a confrontation with trauma and difficult things that ordinarily you'd want to push down, that in a sense maybe SSRIs can help with keeping down, killing the messenger. Whereas psychedelics, it's like you can't push it down, at least dose dependently, it's going to come up, and it does come up. And that's why it's so important when we talk about psychedelic medicine that we emphasize that it's not just about the drug. Sure, you only have few dosing sessions typically, but you also have those dosing sessions in a particular way with psychological support and music listening and a sense of ceremony and ritual, aftercare and preparation. So it's not about just taking the drug.
Yeah, what proportion would you say is due to, because the therapy is referred to as psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So what proportion of the effect would you say is attributable to the psychedelic versus the psychotherapy?
It's a billion-dollar question, quite possibly, because it's affecting the industry development in this space, because psychotherapy is expensive. Psychotherapists are expensive, so it's not convenient and economical and efficient to have that psychotherapy component. psychotherapy itself comes with limitations. There can be, bad practice, for example, and it can be agitative and set people back, open things up. So it's a complication that some drug developers in this space, they don't like it. They really rather, some of them, get the good benefit, but without all the fireworks and the trip and so on, and the need for psychotherapy. So it's a complicated one. The truth of the matter is no one currently has good enough evidence to answer your question. And that's why there's a debate. And so you have people like me, who is a believer in the holistic nature of the model, that it's more than just a drug. It's about how the drug is given. Yet I can't put firm evidence on that position. I could bring in a bunch of indirect evidence and say, but that's how people have done this for, generation upon generation, not just since the 60s, but, with psychedelic plant medicines and so on. It's always been in that ceremonial way, typically with music. However, because I know it's a shortcoming of the science, I'm doing some science on it. So right now we're launching a study at UCSF, San Francisco, that is controlling set and setting and controlling drug. So we have drug versus placebo. Drug is psilocybin. And we have two versions of set and setting. One we call enriched, which looks a lot like standard psychedelic therapy, with music listening and preparation and integration work and supervision, good guiding supervision of the sessions. And then we have an unenriched version, which is the daring thing that we're doing for the sake of science and development, is that we're stripping away some of those elements that we think are important. So there's no music, we're not decorating the room, we have staff looking after people, but we're not doing psychotherapy. So it's tricky, it's elevating some risk, and there's some important ethical questions to consider. But if you don't do the work and do the science, you open up this uncertainty that could get filled by bad practice. So that's the way it goes sometimes with science.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned how lucrative traditional treatment is. Have you gotten any pushback? I mean, I would imagine that this is something that the pharmaceutical industry is probably, sweating about, the idea that you could just take a few doses potentially of this drug with or without the appropriate set and setting, but that ultimately this would displace an incredibly lucrative drug market.
Yeah, I haven't seen any overt evidence of sort of corruption in that sense, but there've been things along the way where I felt a deep establishment pushing back. We did a trial, a head-to-head psilocybin therapy versus escitalopram. Escitalopram's an SSRI, gold standard first-line treatment for depression. It's probably worth, I don't know, billions of dollars as an asset. And we ran that trial. The results were pretty positive for psilocybin therapy. 90+% of the measures that we had in significantly favored the psilocybin therapy, but one didn't. And it was just Sod's law, in a sense, or Murphy's law, that the one that didn't was we call it a pre-registered primary outcome measure. So we say this will be the first measure that we assess the relative effectiveness of these treatments on. And you do that so you don't cherry pick at the end of the study your favorite measure and tell the world about that. So it missed on that pre-registered outcome measure, but that really dominated the narrative. And the top medical journal published the trial, which we were all delighted about, but dictated very aggressively, it felt, the narrative around the results. So much so that a chart that shows that superiority on all of the measures except one was buried. We couldn't put it in the main paper.
Wow. The FDA recently decided against something related to MDMA, right? The use of MDMA, citing a lack of sufficient evidence, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong. And what's come up in the news a lot lately is this phenomena of the revolving door, where you see a lot of employees at the FDA, 1 year, the next year having a seat at some C-level, position at a pharmaceutical company, and this whole phenomena that seems to happen in the United States, sadly. And so I just wonder if there's any relationship there.
Well, so I guess that kind of soft corruption. So you can see it a bit, but it's not so overt that you've got a smoking gun as such. I guess we have, a novel approach. Sure, it has a longer history, but in terms of modern medicine, it's novel. It's more about allowing the expression of the message rather than killing the messenger. It's not suppressing symptoms, but working on a deeper quality of care around psychological insight and self-understanding. So it's a real challenge to the status quo and the dominant models. So there is that kind of subtle, conservative pushback that we're feeling now. What happened with the MDMA trials is that the science was done, I think over 200 people treated in 2 separate trials, MDMA therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, fantastic results, MDMA therapy versus placebo, highly significant improvements with the MDMA versus the placebo, something like 70% remission rates, I think it was, across the 2 trials.
Wow.
So forget about placebo, that's amazing. However, most people guessed when they got the MDMA in particular, and because that, what we call blinding, that uncertainty about what you got was corrupted, it didn't hold. The regulators, the FDA, said the science isn't convincing enough. The problem with that is that blinding rarely holds, especially in psychoactive drug studies. Most psychiatric drugs you know about. I mean, the ketamine trials, ketamine got through as a medicine. People know about it when they get ketamine. SSRIs, more often than not, you work out that you're in the SSRI arm. There's side effects and so on.
That's a really important note. That's like, it's not like a statin drug, for example, where you could create a sham treatment. With these, like, whether or not you're rolling on MDMA
generally, especially
tripping hard on psychedelics.
Especially with psychedelics. But because psychedelics have that conspicuous, psychological profile, and you work it out, you can feel it. It sort of shines a light on the nature of the game as being especially silly in that context. So really, for me, it highlights the shortcomings of the model in that context. And it's like we've reified the model, we've made it something sacred, like, oh, you can't do it another way than a double-blind RCT, without realizing that we only use that model to try and say with confidence that our treatment is more than snake oil, that it's doing something substantive in the body and the brain that is more than just positive expectancy. So for a good while, the double-blind RCT looked like the most rigorous way to demonstrate that. But that method, it just doesn't work very well in the context of psychedelics. So there's got to be another way to demonstrate that your treatment is more than snake oil. And it turns out there's a bunch of ways we could do that. So this is where we are. It's challenging models on multiple levels. And that's, in a sense, part of the fun, but to others, part of the frustration is that it's all quite uphill and it's difficult.
Sometimes it's said colloquially that psychedelics help the brain essentially rewire itself. Is there any scientific truth to that statement?
Yeah, that's not so loose as to be pseudoscience. I mean, it's a bit buzzy and a bit hypey, but one of the most reliable findings in biological psychiatry is that stress and adversity in humans, atrophies the brain. So you have a loss of grey matter, the neuronal components, the communication components in the brain after stress. I mean, you see that in other animals than just humans when people do animal research. But in humans, you see it with histories of adversity, or in psychopathology, mental illness, when you assume a history of adversity. Let's say it's in post-traumatic stress disorder or depression. More often than not, you do have that history of adversity. So the brain, in a sense, shrinks. And if you do the animal work and look at actual neurons, you see that it's the branchy bits, the communicating arms, like a TV aerial almost. Dendrites, yeah, that shrivel up and atrophy with stress. Recently, there's been some amazing findings. First, it was seen with ketamine, and now with classic psychedelics as well, including psilocybin, that those branchy bits come back.
Wow.
In fact, it's the bits that atrophy that seem to spring back. They're recovered. Synaptic recovery is the phenomenon. So, sure, it's a bit jargonistic and sounds a bit pseudoscience-y, but it's not that far off. And in humans, people don't always realize this until they go into neuroscience. We're very limited by the tools that we have to look in the brain. Brain imaging is fantastic, but its resolution is only so good. We can't see branchy bits on neurons. You have to, pull out the actual tissue to do that. So we make indirect inferences about the health of the brain. But we are sat on some really exciting data in terms of anatomical brain changes after psychedelic use in humans, seen through brain imaging. One paper we put out as a preprint recently, so it hasn't quite got through the peer review process. It's been under peer review for ages, to be honest, close to 2 years. Wow. But it's showing a change in the cabling of the brain. Big cables that run from the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, into the middle, the thalamus and the striatum. And those tracks become less diffuse along their trajectory. We don't know what it means. In the study, we gave people a psychedelic for the first time in their lives, and they improved. Their mood improved, their well-being improved, and their cognition improved, their cognitive flexibility improved. So those changes were good, and the brain changes, we don't know. They didn't correlate with those improvements. So it was a small sample, but the effect seemed pretty robust in the brain. The effects on well-being and cognition were pretty robust. So it's exciting. And then we've got some other preliminary data suggestive of some increases in cortical thickness. They're subtle, but you wouldn't really want them to be anything other than subtle if they're real. And small samples. So we'll see. But then if you look in animals, we do see what's called synaptogenesis, which is the growth of the branchy stuff. That's very reliable now. Even after single doses of psilocybin, there's been evidence of increased synaptogenesis and other different markers of neuroplasticity as well, and anatomical neuroplasticity, so the growth of aspects of neurons.
Well, given such positive influence on neurogenesis, is there any data to suggest that that these drugs might be useful in the setting of dementia, Alzheimer's disease?
That's what obviously people hope, because treatments are so bad and so lacking, and we see these changes in animals, and then the early suggestive stuff in humans, and then all the mental health improvements, which are really robust and reliable now, and some cognitive improvements. So it's a lot of indirect suggestive evidence. We just we need to do the trials, and I know it's like the party line I'm coming out with here, but it is necessary not to get ahead of the evidence. So it's suggestive that we should do those trials, and maybe there's something there, but too early to say that it would work, or even that it would do the desirable changes to the brain. We just don't know.
Yeah, I hope we do get to investigate that. I mean, that's an important question. How did you become interested in this field?
Yeah, these days I'm okay with sharing. Of course, it took some psychedelics, didn't it? But yeah, that happened in my teens, just as a kind of reckless teenage thing that some teenagers do. And that opened my eyes and mind. But then it sort of fell dormant. That was just like almost like teenage, misdemeanor. But then probably because of it, but I wasn't aware that it was because of it, I was drawn to psychology. And then after about a decade, I realized I was doing my degree in psychology and getting really into certain aspects of psychology, and then it dawned on me psychedelics as tools to understand the mind and the brain, and I put the pieces together, and I got really excited, and then like dedicated my life to it then. So it started off as a reckless thing, but in a sort of full circle way became a very academic and scholarly thing. It's funny how it works.
Yeah. I've always been very conservative with mind-altering substances, but I began experimenting with microdosing psilocybin, not on a daily basis, but just intermittently in my mid-30s, around the time that I began writing my first book, which is called Genius Foods. And I distinctly remember the sense that these compounds, that the feeling that I was getting while, I guess, under the influence of them, was actually enhancing my creativity. Like I was, they gave me a new sort of like framework with which to understand and ultimately to describe verbally the concepts that I was thinking about and writing about. And a lot of the ways that I thought to describe these concepts that I was talking about, nutrition related concepts and the like, ended up making their way into my book. Which is not something that I think many people know. And that book ended up, becoming a bestseller and the like. But I thought that was a really interesting, and I wasn't aware of any research on the impact of these drugs on creativity. But is that something that you can speak to? I mean, is there any evidence that these drugs might actually act as a creative lubricant? Because that's how I felt.
There's a bunch of anecdote and some really interesting cases, like Steve Jobs said taking LSD was one of the most important things he did, if not the most important things. Inspiration. Carey Mullis, who discovered PCR, a way to read genetic code, came to that insight, he claims, through an LSD experience. So there's a bunch of these. There are rumors about Crick and Watson and psychedelics and the insight there. There are others. Even the idea of getting a whole picture of the Earth was an insight that came from a psychedelic experience that then, motivated that mission to get that photo.
Wow.
From the astronauts. Pretty out there.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah. So there's a bunch of stuff like that, and the problem with creativity is it's kind of like defining it as part of the problem, and then getting it into a study without killing the thing that you're interested in, because it's naturally dynamic creativity. It's like spirit. Musicians will talk about grace and channeling spirit and so on. Entering flow states, and they're like characteristically free, and science is about constraint, and so it's a hard thing. It's like the science needs to capture it rather than try and create it and then look at it. So we're yet to really create an experimental setup that can sample this thing that we all suspect is real, that psychedelics can enhance creativity. There is a project going on that's trying to crack this problem, and a project that we're working on with colleagues at UCSF will involve further collection of anecdotes, actually, but to try and get something and get a bit of inspiration for then knowing how best to capture it. I had an interesting dinner recently with a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, and he's inspired, and he wants to grease the wheels of some research. And so we said, well, what is it that you want to do? And he said it's music and it's flow. And it's the idea that maybe psychedelics enhance the entering of flow states when creating that art form. So I had this playful idea of, okay, we could do a concert series called Artists on Drugs. We could.
Can you get me a ticket?
Well, this is it. It's a winner, right? Maybe people would come with the artist side up, probably. And then you could have like a small number of drugs that they would take. Of course, there's a legality issue, but I don't know. It's a fun idea, and there's decrim in certain cities. Not all drugs are illegal. So you could do, one day it could be the placebo, and there could be a couple of doses of, say, psilocybin, and then maybe a stimulant in there as well. It's a fun idea. Sometimes science it can be playful, and yet still produce some results that are meaningful.
Yeah, I remember reading a couple of years ago a study. I don't remember exactly what compound it was. It was either MDMA or psilocybin, but it seemed to elicit correlates, at least on imaging, that are thought to be associated with creativity, that disparate parts of the brain were communicating that don't normally talk to one another under normal everyday circumstances.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, that was one of ours.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it was psilocybin and fMRI, and it was the way that the results were illustrated, that were shown. So it was two circles. One is placebo. Around the periphery of the circles are dots, which are brain regions, and those dots are colored based on the systems that they belong to. And what we saw with placebo is that most of the connections, which are representing synchronous activity, which suggests that regions are functionally connected, they talk to each other. So most of that functional connectivity happened within systems. So all the blue dots were linking up to only the other blue dots. So you didn't really see any lines crossing over the middle of the circles on placebo. But on psilocybin, it was very multicolored and crisscrossy across the circle. So different systems opening up and talking to each other. I use the analogy of like a Christmas party, where, say, within an institution, most people would stick to their own groups and only talk to their own colleagues, within their departments. But at a really good Christmas party, maybe with something in the punch,
spike the punch
in the Kool-Aid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a different.
Wow,
different
so
setup. Exciting.
So what was the conclusion based on that?
It was extrapolation that that there's an opening up of functionality, because the regions in a system are specialized. They do something specific. So regions within the visual system, or a visual system, because there's a few, are doing vision, and they're specialized in that specific functional module. So when you get an opening up and a crosstalk between systems, it's suggesting that there's a breakdown in boundaries between different functions that the brain subserves.
Is that related to how like people with synesthesia
maybe
might perceive the world?
Yeah, that was an extrapolation that, we do have regions belonging to an auditory system, regions belonging to a visual system. If they're talking to each other more, maybe it relates to the way that people say they can, see sounds and hear colors under psychedelics.
Wow. What is the default mode network and its relationship to consciousness and mental health?
Yeah, the default mode network, the name is suggestive. The default mode, so it's a set of regions in the brain that are ordinarily very active, very metabolically hungry. There's a lot of blood flow there, and they're also hubs for connectivity. A lot of communication comes into these centers and is routed out as well. So it's a really important system. There are also reasons to think that hierarchically it's high level. So if a low level of the functional hierarchy is concerned with more simple functions like motor function, moving your body, or sensory functioning like seeing things or hearing things, that's low level. Then high level is abstract thinking. And humans are such weird animals because we do so much of that abstract thinking, and it's the default mode network that's closest to that abstract level of functioning, imagining things, imagining the future, the past, having high level beliefs, having a belief in one's self as being a self. So self-referencing and a sense of self itself seems to be somewhat dependent on functioning within the default mode network. So it's a very high-level system that is ordinarily very active, and when we disengage from specific things and kind of freewheel in a daydreamy, imaginative way, then activity in the default mode network is especially high. Yeah.
One of the coolest metaphors that I have come across, I think maybe I first heard it, I had Michael Pollan on my podcast a couple of years ago, and it might have originated from you, I don't know, but I first came across this metaphor of the brain and consciousness functioning like a continuum between order and disorder. And most of us are designed to function like an iPhone, where we have a very streamlined way of consciousness, and we're somewhere on that spectrum in the middle of order and disorder. And that, people who are more creative might be more prone to a consciousness that's more disordered in its thinking, permitting one to maybe see things from outside the box, from a different vantage point than others. And somebody who's more prone to order might be, more prone to neuroses and anxiety and things like that, and that this is ultimately related to the default mode network. And then also, interestingly, applicable to how these drugs work.
Yeah. In
the sense that for somebody who's more prone to anxiety and rumination and neuroses, whose consciousness falls more, in the direction of order, might take one of these compounds like psilocybin, pushing them ever so slightly towards, the mean.
Yeah. So there's something to it, yeah. I called it a few years ago the entropic brain, and it's the idea that there's a singular dimension, a continuum with order at one end, where at the extremes of that order, so it's a living brain, but at the extremes of order, there's no consciousness. The individual is unconscious, and deep sleep, anesthetized states, disorders of consciousness like coma, a lot of medications that sedate, they push you down into that pole. And there's a threshold, below that threshold, you're unconscious. And then you dial up, like dialing a chaos dial or a disorder dial, and you come up into, you know, a bit of drowsiness, and okay, there's a bit of wakefulness now, up into normal waking consciousness, like where we are now. Maybe I'm a little on the drowsy side. And then as you go past the sort of midpoint, you're dialing up brain entropy, and consciousness becomes more variegated. There's more to it. There's more going on. It's more changeable. It's very flexible. And that's the psychedelic-like or psychedelic state. And we first demonstrated that in 2017 with the brain imaging technique called EEG, like those caps, and you see the brain waves. We saw it with LSD, psilocybin, ketamine, that as people go into that psychedelic or psychedelic-like state, the brain entropy goes up. It's now become a really reliable principle. Dose-dependently, it'll dial up in proportion to the dose. It seems somewhat specific to psychedelics, so stimulants don't do it. THC and cannabis doesn't do it. So we've also found recently that the bigger the effect, this entropic brain effect, the dialing up of disorder, the bigger the change in certain aspects of people's psychology, in fact their mental health, as far ahead as a month, at least that's the limit where we measured to. So we give them a psychedelic, measure their brain entropy with EEG, see the entropic brain effect, and the bigger it is, the bigger the improvements in well-being 1 month later. So it's both a way to read out on the intensity of a trip, but also how much someone could change downstream as far ahead as a month. So really excited about that principle. Tying in psychopathology, as I just did in terms of talking about well-being, I don't think it's a simple one-to-one relationship. I think what we're seeing with the entropic brain effect is a marker of plasticity. Plasticity generally defined as changeability. Essentially, it's how big a window of opportunity for change is opening. You know, bigger entropic brain effect, bigger window of opportunity for change. That's what I think it is. Yeah, and we suspect that a lot of mental illness is the opposite of plasticity. At least that's a sort of theory that I'm working with. People become stuck in a rut in many different ways, yet the getting stuck is a consistent thing. So you could get stuck in, you know, negative ruminative thinking and depression. You could get stuck on getting anxious about being anxious in anxiety disorders, or stuck on certain triggers of anxiety and phobias or PTSD. You can get stuck with caloric control in anorexia and ways of looking at yourself and your body. You can get stuck on thoughts of contamination and hand washing in OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. So a lot of mental illness, and my idea is the major chunk of mental illness, not all of it, but the major chunk of it is that stuckness. And in terms of how it would relate to brain order to disorder, it would be an excess of certain kinds of order, certain regimes of functioning that have become too habitual, too practiced, too reinforced, and need a good shake-up in a sense.
And the potential risk of pushing a brain too far in the direction of disorder, although, you know, obviously inching it closer that way obviously is going to have therapeutic, you know, benefits for many, as you just described. Also for some, could put them too far in that direction, might be where you would find schizophrenia, right?
Yeah.
And also synesthesia, possibly, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yes, synesthesia, yes, that's an easier yes. Schizophrenia is a complicated one because some of schizophrenia is a kind of stuckness. You know, you get stuck on a certain delusion, or your thinking gets kind of muddy and stuck, and you sort of retreat from the world. Yet another aspect of schizophrenia can be the florid psychotic episodes where everything is chaotic. So in that sense, yes, acute psychotic states and maybe early psychotic states as someone is on the cusp of transitioning into a psychotic disorder, that's where there might be special risk, and dialing up brain entropy, brain disorder could be pushing them into a psychotic regime, which, especially perhaps at a certain age, could be dangerous.
Yeah, I don't know the relationship that THC has with this continuum, but I mean, I'm somebody I'm a creative person, and I've always felt, I mean, one of the reasons why I've always been so conservative with my psychoactive substances is because THC, which is legal in tons of states and it's considered to be a gateway drug for so many people, makes me actually feel psychotic. So when I was fascinated by this metaphor, because it kind of applies neuroscience to this subjective sensation that I've always felt. When I take THC, it actually makes me feel like I'm going nuts in a way.
Me too.
Interesting.
And there seems to be a relationship between actually the potency of the cannabis, the THC content, and that risk. But one of the most reliable drug models of psychosis is THC, pure THC. But THC isn't a classic psychedelic. Whether or not it does the entropic brain effect, there was a study that was done recently with EEG and a couple of doses of THC, and it wasn't seen. At least it wasn't seen like psychedelics. So it's not entirely clear to me whether that, in a sense, psychotomimetic or psychotogenic producing psychosis effect of THC is because of an entropic brain effect or something else. And I suspect it might be something else. So dopamine plays a major role in schizophrenia. Most antipsychotic drugs block dopamine. That's how they work. And THC can promote dopamine functioning. One thing that dopamine gives you is a sense of salience, of importance. And one of the most popular models of psychosis is this aberrant salience model of psychosis, which says that people ascribe too much importance to stuff because of an abnormality in their dopamine functioning, too much dopamine release.
Fascinating. What is the current state of legality and ultimately access to the kinds of therapies that you're studying, in case anybody listening to this, watching this, either they themselves or has a family member or a loved one that might be interested in this as a therapeutic tool?
Yeah. Well, access at the moment is very limited. In the States, Oregon have legalized psilocybin therapy, but it's expensive. And it's only available in Oregon. Colorado are opening up a similar initiative, a little bit more liberal actually, a few other drugs. And Massachusetts have a ballot initiative happening right now that could do something similar. Those are the state level initiatives. There's no legal access in the US. Ketamine is an exception, but not everyone would consider that a psychedelic. I'm a little on the fence myself as to whether it is. Depends how you define psychedelic. And otherwise it's travel, it's going to the Amazon or going to for ayahuasca or Mexico, where the legality is a little grayer around certain psychedelic medicines. So there's an access problem. The medical route to getting an FDA medicine regulator approved, psychedelic medicine at the federal level, that was tried recently with MDMA therapy after I don't know how many millions of dollars, let's say 150, something like that. And the FDA rejected it. And I think we're a couple of years away from the next effort, which will be psilocybin therapy for depression, and a few different companies doing phase 3 trials now. that they'll take to the FDA in probably 2026. That will be the big watershed moment for access, probably. Will be the first federally approved psychedelic medicine where it will then make it a prescription medicine. You can go to your doctor, explain your symptoms, and they could prescribe this treatment for you.
Is there anything that people watching, listening to this can do to help accelerate your efforts and the ultimate access to these tools?
It's difficult, because there's been some healthy pushback in the area because of an excess of hype. So it's like putting the word out isn't really it anymore, because in a sense that's become almost a bit of a problem with too much enthusiasm ahead of the evidence. We're always limited by funding, but that's the way it is. It's hard to get mainstream funding for this work. It has been historically. I hope that changes soon. I got 3 grants in with NIH at the moment. Otherwise, it's been philanthropy. Philanthropy's floated the whole space. And otherwise, it's the professional route of training to be a clinician or a scientist, and that's happening a lot. And I did hear wise words from a colleague once who said, if you really want to get into this space, like, do the work, and actually don't necessarily train to be a psychedelic scientist. Train to be a specialist in something like, I don't know, psychiatry or addiction, and then you can, if the opportunity then arises, you can take that specialism and have a special skill set should you then go into psychedelic research.
Yeah, I mean, it's so direly needed to catalyze progress here, because
I think so. I mean, people talk about the mental health crisis, and there is some suggestions of rising rates, especially in the young. That's where the evidence is clearest, especially young women, actually. So things like the anorexia trial that we did in London is really important in that regard. It's tricky because in young people you have the greatest opportunity to intervene early on to change the course of their life in a positive direction. But equally, you have elevated risk and you want to do no harm. And of course, there's special sensitivities around giving any drugs to young people. So that's almost sort of like the very dilemma we have with psychedelics. The very power that makes them incredibly potentially beneficial is the same power that brings special risk. And then you sort of concentrate that principle in young people.
Yeah, well, we have to continue doing the research and doing it rigorously, and promoting that these drugs are seen with the respect that they deserve, and that setting is everything.
We think we're testing it.
We're testing it. Yeah, maybe it's not. Maybe we should just start putting it in the water.
Probably not. Probably.
Yeah.
It's there is a possibility here. So people have talked about this idea that psychedelics have an intrinsic healing action, and it's been poo-pooed by some people as being pseudoscientific, beyond the science, almost sort of, I don't know, like supernatural in nature. The phenomenon is referred to as this inner healer action, or the inner healing intelligence. But you hear it again and again, people refer to this thing. So there is a possibility that there's something to the drug action that trends towards or tends towards healing that maybe is even more fundamental than set and setting. That doesn't mean that it's independent of set and setting at all. It just means that there could actually be something intrinsically trending towards healing in the drug action. It's just unreliable.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember hearing Roland Griffiths, the late Roland Griffiths, talk about how the magnitude of the antidepressive effect was related to how mystical the experience felt. while being under the influence.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a few different dimensions that seem to predict therapeutic response, the magnitude of a mystical type experience, sense of union with other people, the world in general, nature, dissolving of ego boundaries, sense of ineffability, can't put it into words. There's that. Also, strong emotional release, emotional catharsis is strongly predictive of therapeutic response. Often that looks like people crying. So it's behavioral and physiological as well as psychological. And then psychological insight. And those are probably the three dimensions that are where there's the most evidence of if those are strong, then therapeutic response is more likely.
Well, so many people today are struggling from these diseases of despair. So I applaud your work, and I hope that we can continue to see progress made in the field in which you are a pioneer. So thank you for doing what you do. One last question for you, but before I get there, where can people connect with you on social media? How can they support your work? Any initiatives that you might want to support so that people can help get behind?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'm writing a book. That's one thing, so I'll plug that. It's probably going to be called, my editor will be angry at this. You've got to always hold the title lightly. It's changed a million times. But how psychedelics work, short and sweet, to the point. Probably out next year. And website, Carhart-Harris.com, Carhart-Harris Lab, all one word. And then social media, I am active on X, Twitter. I can't remember my handle. Carhart-Harris, something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, the last question that gets asked to everybody on my podcast, which is called The Genius Life, is what does living a genius life mean to you?
Wow. A genius life. Well, it's a hard one, that. It's a hard one. Novelty, novel associations, but also specialism, yeah. The ability to be a specialist, not necessarily a jack of all trades, but a master of one. Just some thoughts there.
I like that, to pick something and go deep. Put another way, find what you love and let it kill you.
Yeah, do you know? There's a trait that goes close with autism spectrum disorder. I think they call it monotropism, and it's close to monomania. It's like a one-track mindedness. And I heard this and I gulped and I thought, oh God, I'm obviously on the spectrum.
Me too.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, I've got a one-track mind for just a handful of, nutrition, music, film, maybe, but that's it. My brain is like a light switch. So it's great to find kindred spirits in this crazy, hectic world. Well, thank you again for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you guys for being here. Thank you, Eudaimonia, for having me. And this was super fun. Thank you, Dr. Carhart-Harris.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.